Hello and welcome to a new video. This one will be a little bit different. I wanted to make videos about where we live for a while. Well, we've done a few videos, but I wanted to do like a video of things to do in Calgary, which is where we live. But since moving to Calgary seems to be a hot topic right now, I decided to do a video about moving to Calgary first and kind of comparing Calgary to Vancouver and Toronto. The reason why I'm comparing to these two is because I used to live near Toronto for like 10 years and I've been to Vancouver several times and I had friends that lived there for a while, so I kind of know what it is like to live there. And the first thing I want to talk about here is affordability. Calgary is way more affordable than both Toronto and Vancouver, but we're gonna break that down a little further. And starting with housing, the average house price in Vancouver is 1.2 million versus 1.1 for Toronto. For the average working class person, it is pretty much impossible to buy a house in any of the two cities, and you're maybe hoping just to buy a condo or something like that. However, in Calgary, the average house price is 570,000. So now moving to Calgary, you would be able to afford to buy your own house. Furthermore, we do not have a sales tax here, so pretty much everything else is more affordable. Just for comparison, sales taxes, HST in Ontario is 13%, in BC is 12%, they have GST and PST. In Alberta, you would only be charged GST, 5% GST on your purchases. Now let's take a look at average salaries. Vancouver has the highest average salary at almost $55,000 per year. However, Vancouver is by far the most expensive city to live in Canada. Calgary is not too far behind at $48,500 per year, and Toronto is way at the back at $39,000. And please take these numbers with a grain of salt. Numbers can be different across different industries, and in certain industries, salaries in Calgary could be higher than Vancouver and vice versa, Toronto as well. So this is just an approximation. You should check salaries in your industry and just compare between the cities before deciding whether you want to move or not. And last thing I'm going to talk about here is unemployment. Calgary at 6.6% has the highest unemployment rate right now between these three cities. Vancouver has the lowest at 5.1, second is Toronto at 5.3. So just keep in mind that Calgary currently has a high unemployment rate, and just like if you have a job elsewhere, probably don't move into Calgary unless you can find a job here. Also, our economy here is tied to oil prices and it's very cyclical, it goes up and down, so just another thing to keep in mind. And the second thing I want to talk about here is the outdoorsy lifestyle. And of course, Calgary does have a vibrant downtown area, and if you want to live the city life, you can in Calgary. Just in terms of city life, Vancouver and Toronto are way better than Calgary. So if that's what you're looking for, you might want to either stay or move to Toronto or Vancouver. And all three cities have large city parks and are suitable for outdoorsy lifestyle. However, I think Calgary would be best in that area. And this here is Fish Creek Park. This park alone is bigger than all parks in Vancouver combined. It is the second largest urban park in Canada, only behind Rouge National Urban Park in the Greater Toronto area. And Nose Hill Park is almost as big as Fish Creek. But how about some real hiking within city limits? This is actually near downtown, just on the outskirts of downtown Calgary. This is Douglas Fir Trail. We do have detailed video about this trail, and it is in Edwardy Park. And yes, both Toronto and Vancouver have amazing city parks as well. But because there are less people living in Calgary and more available park area, there's just more on per capita basis. Both Calgary and Toronto have approximately 8,000 hectares of parks. However, Calgary has less than half the population of Toronto. And Vancouver is way behind here. They only have 1,300 hectares. And although these views here are amazing, I'm sure that someone in the comments down there will say that the parks in Vancouver are even more spectacular, which I agree. I think they are probably better in that regards. There's just more parks in Calgary than what it is in Vancouver. How about the views here from Kushiro Park in Burnaby? Look at that, absolutely amazing. And now let's talk about the actual outdoors. Everything outside the city limits of Calgary is pretty much wilderness. To the east, it is the prairies. To the west, it is the Rocky Mountains. There are many regional and provincial parks such as Brock Creek or Kananaskis. And we also have Banff National Park. And when it comes to Toronto, you have to drive pretty far out before you can get to any type of wilderness. Yes, Northern Ontario is all wild, but it is far from Toronto, and also you have to worry about the traffic. But Vancouver, similarly to Calgary, has a lot of wilderness right around it. There are many mountains, and they have Whistler, which is roughly the same distance from Vancouver as it is Banff from Calgary. But the drive from Vancouver to Whistler, and of course that depends on which part of Vancouver, but it roughly takes about an hour and 45 minutes. At the same time, the drive from Calgary takes about an hour and 15 minutes. Way less traffic, bigger freeways. It is a freeway all the way to Banff. So it is much more accessible. Well, I don't know if accessible is the right word, but like easily accessible, I guess. And maybe I should add by car here. You need to drive in Calgary. And yes, traffic is a problem in both Toronto and Vancouver. Living the city on a weekend especially can be difficult. Speaking of traffic, Calgary has it way better than Toronto and Vancouver. The city is more spread out, and it has lots of freeways, more freeways per capita, and this leaves more space, and it's way easier to get around. Even rush hour traffic is pretty decent. Even if there are some traffic issues, they're usually related to an accident or construction, and are usually related to a specific area. You can always go around it. I usually check Google Maps before leaving, and if I see that there is an area with traffic jams and stuff, I simply go around it. Pretty much never the whole city gets clogged with traffic, maybe one area, and then you can easily avoid it. We don't really have stop and go traffic here in Calgary like they do in Toronto and Vancouver. During rush hour, these two are pretty much clogged with traffic. So just keep that in mind. If you decide to move to Calgary, you would have much easier time getting around the city than you would if you lived in Toronto or Vancouver. And just to add here, Calgary is pretty well connected with freeways. So is Toronto, which actually has the 401, which is one of the widest highways in North America with 10 lanes going in one direction at certain sections. That's including the collectors. On the other hand, Vancouver only has the Trans-Canada highway that is the only freeway passing through the actual city of Vancouver. They do have some freeways outside in Metro Vancouver, like Richmond, Delta, but through the actual city, they only have that one freeway. In general, in the summer, Calgary is a city where it's very easy to get around, much easier than Toronto and Vancouver. But that is by car. Using public transportation is completely different story. Calgary is built around the car and around driving. Yes, we do have LRT, the C train, but the city is not very well connected. It can be hard to reach certain parts of the city using public transport, including the airport. The train doesn't reach the airport, unlike Vancouver and Toronto, which do have train connections. Vancouver has the SkyTrain and Toronto has the subway, and you can argue that their cities are not very well connected transportation wise if you compare them to Europe or Asia. However, they're still way better than Calgary. And Toronto specifically gets pretty close to a European city with their trams. They're very well connected, and it's fairly easy to get around downtown. But the transportation problems for Calgarians don't end within the city limits. For example, if you want to access the outdoors, if you want to go to the mountains like Banff, for example, you don't really have any other option besides driving. There are some buses, but they're not very frequent nor convenient. And yes, there are no passenger trains in Calgary at all. No passenger trains coming in, no trains leaving from Calgary, no trains passing through. If you wanted to catch a passenger train, you would have to go all the way to Edmonton. And at the same time, Toronto is very well connected train-wise, at least east towards Eastern Canada or south into the US. Not so much north and west into the rest of Canada, but they do have trains going into Northern Ontario or Western Canada. You can catch a train from Toronto going all the way to Vancouver, passing through Edmonton, not Calgary. And obviously, Vancouver is connected to the rest of Canada via Toronto and also south into the US, and they do have trains going into the mountains. You can catch a train from Vancouver to Whistler, for example. And there are plans to start a train service from Calgary to Banff, but that's not gonna happen anytime before 2027, if ever. So if you're planning to move to Calgary, you will need to own a car and drive. And speaking of driving in Calgary, you need winter tires. Yes, we have to talk about the weather. Winter in Calgary can be very beautiful, but it is 6 months long. And we're gonna have to talk about streets plowing, which is not great in Calgary. I'm not sure how it is in Vancouver. I've never been there when it snowed, and it rarely ever snows in Vancouver. So even if it does, it only is once in a while. However, in Toronto, it snows a lot. It can snow a lot in a very short period of time. But streets get plowed very well, at least compared to Calgary. Now, I do see people complaining online a lot about Toronto not being plowed a whole lot. But if you're thinking about moving to Calgary and you're from Toronto and you think that the streets are not plowed in Toronto, you're gonna be very surprised in Calgary. If I had to compare snow plowing in Toronto and in Calgary, I would have to say in Toronto, they catch the snowflakes while still in the air. So driving and winter tires are a must in Calgary. And I'm just gonna add here that salt is not being used a whole lot on the streets of Calgary. Instead, they use gravel, and that's for traction. Generally speaking, snow and ice stays on the road for a long time after it snows. And when the snow melts eventually, this loose gravel starts flying around and usually breaks windshields. And it is very small gravel, but my windshield, for example, never lasts more than 2 years. But speaking of snow, we almost never get too much snow all at once in Calgary. This year, in this footage is one time we had 40 centimeters of snow overnight. And this happened on Christmas Day, I believe, 2020. And I think we had one more time 40 centimeters, but it was over 2 days. Usually we get little. We don't get a whole lot of snow all at once. But the thing is that it doesn't melt. Unlike Toronto, where you can get a lot of snow, like 20 centimeters over 2 hours, but it doesn't stay long on the ground. It will melt maybe in a week or maybe 2 weeks. That's not the case in Calgary. Here, usually the snow that falls beginning of November stays and it just keeps adding up and doesn't melt until around the end of April. We also do get snow in September and October as well as in May, but this melts unlike the rest. And the snow staying on the ground for so long is due to several factors. The main one, of course, it gets really, really cold in Calgary. Yes, Toronto is also cold. It gets as low as minus 30 wind chill factor in Toronto. However, in Calgary, we have at least a few days every year with wind chill temperatures into the minus 40s. After 2 minutes outside, look at my eyelashes. This is what minus 40 is. Oh my god, my hand is freezing. And you need a block heater to start the car in the winter. It is not always cold. We do get these westerly winds called Chinooks, and they bring pretty warm weather. In the winter, temperatures can be as high as double digits plus in January and February. Now, the thing about these warm days is that they're at least partially cloudy, forming what is called the Chinook Arch. And not a lot of melting happens when we have those warm days. Also, Calgary is much further up north than Toronto, so the days are much shorter in the winter. The sun is lower in the sky at more of an angle, so this is why not a lot of snow melts in the winter, and this is why we have the snow staying on the ground for so long. It doesn't always happen. Usually southern facing slopes are the ones to melt first, so you might have times during the winter when at least southern facing slopes are melted, but the northern ones, they get a lot less sunlight and much less likely to melt. And the snow that you would usually get in Calgary is normally fluffy, powdery snow, which is easy to shovel. On the other hand, winters here can be very pleasant because it is sunny most of the time. Our winters are very sunny, and it can be very pleasant to be outside when it's minus 10 and you can go walk in a park. This is not the same when you live in Vancouver because it's raining all the time in the winter. And when it rains, when your clothes, when your jacket gets wet, it starts feeling a lot colder, and it's not very pleasant to be outside for extended periods of time. Well, when it's minus 10, not snowing, just sunny, you actually, when you walk around, you start getting layers off. But let's talk about other seasons. In June, it usually rains a lot, and with that rain, we do get a lot of hail and thunderstorms. But of course, the bigger problem is the hail. It can damage the house or the car, which is why it's good to have a garage to have the car protected at least a little bit, at least when it's not on the road. We've had a lot of problems with our garden with the hail. Fortunately, my car never got damaged. However, the most destructive hailstorm in Calgary took place in 2020, and it is the fourth costliest natural disaster in Canada overall. Actually, it was very close to our house, only a few kilometers away. But somehow we got lucky. You can see the damage here on those houses. We drove around just to see how it was, and it looks pretty bad on some of those houses here. Anyways, I think it's starting to get too long, this section here about the weather. I just wanted to say a few words about summer. And summer in Calgary usually falls on Friday. Don't get drunk, you're gonna miss it. But yes, it actually is that short. On average, Calgary gets only 5 days with temperatures over 30 degrees Celsius. Now, this is what I consider summer. If you don't consider summer above 30 degrees Celsius, then you can find it pretty pleasant. Temperatures are around 25 degrees July and August, so it's not too hot and you might actually like it. But it's not humid and hot summer, the one that you get in Toronto, for example. And it's certainly not as long. In Toronto, the summer is pretty long, not so much here in Calgary. And the last thing I want to talk about here is coastline. I'd like to address this because nearly half the world's population lives within 200 kilometers of a coastline. And if you're considering moving to Calgary, you should know there is no coastline anywhere near Calgary. The closest one, Vancouver, the Pacific, is 1,000 kilometers away. And yes, Vancouver is on the Pacific coast. They do have some pretty nice beaches there, although the Pacific in that area is pretty cold. You can still go for a dip in the summer. I guess it would be refreshing. But generally speaking, the temperature of the water is not one that would be comfortable for swimming. The water in Toronto, on the other hand, gets pretty warm. And you might be saying like, hey, Toronto is on the coast. Yes, it is on the coast of Lake Ontario, the 13th largest lake in the world. It is humongous. And it is also connected to the Atlantic via the St. Lawrence River. And it is navigable. Yes, you can sail from Toronto to anywhere else in the world. Well, I guess anywhere else on a coastline. You cannot sail to Calgary. And the water gets pretty warm in the summer. The surface temperature gets around 25 degrees, so you can swim there. And yes, there are beautiful beaches on Lake Ontario, although the better beaches are actually on Lake Erie. And yeah, Lake Erie too is very close to Toronto. In Calgary, we have two fairly big rivers, the Elbow and the Bow, and they're not navigable, but there are a few things you can do on the rivers. Yes, they are fun. It's just not the same like being on a coast of a large lake or an ocean. And on top of that, the water, unsurprisingly, is very cold. Freezing cold, I would say. Like I can dip my toes for only like, I don't know, maybe 15-30 seconds. Some people go in the river and they feel okay. They can actually float like this guy right here. I can't do that though. But there are many places where you can rent floaties, or you can use your own floaties and just float down the river, spend the day on the river.
Baby. Hey. Ow, 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 ow.
But the closest you can get to living on a coast is if you live in one of the lake communities in Calgary. This here is Auburn Lake. So those are man-made lakes, small ones, and the community is built around the lake. The lake has a sandy beach, and they have like paddle or pedal boats that you can take for a spin. It is kind of like renting them, but not really, because you're not really paying, at least when you're taking it. How this works is you pay, I believe it's an yearly fee. So it's kind of like a condo, and then you just pay to use the lake. Now, you can only use the lake if you live in the community. You cannot go to that community if you don't live there. And when I say the lake, I mean the facilities at the lake. So they have barbecues, they have the beach. They do have rooms for events. And in the winter, the lake freezes, and they make a portion of it a skating rink. And as you can see, some of the houses do back into the lake, so you can purchase a lakefront property. But those are the more expensive ones. The cheaper houses, of course, are ones that are not on the lake, but you can still, if you are within the community, you can use the lake facilities. And I'm gonna wrap it up here because this video is already getting too long. I hope that it helps you decide if you want to move to Calgary, or if you're moving to Canada and you're thinking where to move. Thank you very much for spending the time, and I hope I'll see you in the next video. The next video will actually be kind of a continuation of this one, and it will be about things to do in Calgary. A like and subscribe would be very much appreciated.